In today's episode, I speak to Sacha Dench, the founder and CEO of Conservation Without Borders, a charity that researches migratory birds and campaigns for their protection. Sacha is the UN ambassador for migratory species, an adventurer, and a really passionate public speaker and campaigner about the topics of conservation and climate change. She's been called the human Swan after she took a really amazing trip of 7,000 kilometers across 11 countries on a paramotor from the Russian Arctic to the United Kingdom in 2016. And now she's planning a new adventure that will involve the attempt to break two Guinness World Records at the same time. And this is called the Round Britain Climate Challenge. So this is what we love to talk about today. The challenge will take place on the occasion of COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, which is being hosted next year by the UK in Glasgow. And as part of that, Sacha is planning a journey of almost 5,000 kilometers around Britain, and this time on an electric paramotor. Along the route, she's meeting social entrepreneurs and change makers, people that are making a difference and actually bringing about solutions to climate change and to the climate crisis. Her work is now supported by prominent figures such as Sir David Attenborough and actress Dame Judi Dench and some of the world's leading scientists. And I'm really happy to have this conversation with her, not just because I'm very passionate about the impact that her charity and her work has, but also because I'm a paramotorist myself and I look up to your adventures really in envy, having gotten into the sport about 2 years ago. Always the goal to do longer trips across countries, and I'm nowhere near even close to attempting anything like Sacha has. So I'm really glad to have you on here to talk about your campaigns and your adventures. Thanks for joining.
You're very welcome. And can I say that before I actually flew from the Russian Arctic to the UK, the longest journey I'd actually done was Epsom in South London down to the South Coast and back. So,
oh, wow.
There was a lot of, in the run up to the expedition, there was a lot going on. So I'd done a lot of planning and small preparations, but there's nothing like jumping in at the deep end.
Yeah, I'd love to learn more about that in a second, but let's take a step back. Right now, if I look at your life and I look at the talks that you give and the campaigns you do and this amazing Round Britain challenge that we're going to talk about, it seems too good to be true, almost like spending your life campaigning for this great cause and doing these great things and adventures. How does somebody get there? How did you get into this? How does your journey start into conservation and adventures?
Wow. I suppose it has always been there. So I don't think I could ever have gotten rid of it. Very briefly, my childhood was quite mixed. I went to, I think, 14 schools before I was 11 or 11 schools before I was 14. I'm not sure which, but that was from moving around quite a lot, which included the UK, included a little bit of Switzerland, included largely in Australia. So I moved around quite a lot. And some of the big pieces of my childhood were the Australian bush, the very southeast corner is where my mum lived, in a wooden house that we built ourselves over time, but in the middle of the bush. So my nearest friend was about an hour and a half walk away and an hour and a half walk back. And we didn't have a telephone, so we couldn't ring to see if she was in. So I got very comfortable with nature and being outside and definitely felt a part of it. And where my dad was living most of the time was the coast of Sydney, and my dad was a really keen spearfisher and surfer. So I spent a lot of time in the sea and under the waves as well. So I suppose nature, and very kind of quite intense nature that's still quite wild. The Australian coast has got sharks and whales and dolphins and things you actually can see just by swimming off the coast. And the same with my mum's in the bush. There were wombats, there's kangaroos, there's snakes, there's kind of spiders, there's big birds that will come down and eat my little sister's guinea pigs if we're not careful. So nature was quite wild, and I became quite comfortable with that. And then, I suppose also started to notice in my overtime things that I thought weren't right in the way that we interact with nature, but generally with a very practical outlook. So I just thought I could fix that. I think if you did this and this, you could fix it. So I had that attitude from the start that if there are problems, like fix them, as opposed to going, oh my God, there's a problem, isn't this awful? And I guess my parents definitely gave me that sort of impression that if you think something's wrong, do something about it. Like, there's no point just moaning. So that's been in me for a very long time.
Got it. And then you actually studied biology.
Yep. In London, I studied biology and became a marine turtle geneticist.
Got it. So you did that for a while, and then at some point the focus shifted to birds and migratory species, right?
Yes. So I suppose it took me on a bit of a circuitous route to that. So I went from being a scientist. I then had a couple of jobs in science and research. So one of those was working with the Environment Agency, looking at landfill sites and pollution incidents. So that's a kind of whilst marine turtle genetics was quite sexy, it was hanging out on islands off the coast of Australia, catching turtles from a speedboat in what we would call turtle rodeo. So you literally launch yourself from a boat and grab a hold of a turtle and bring it to the surface. So that was quite kind of glamorous and fun. And suddenly I found myself then looking at, issues of waste management and big fish deaths and that kind of thing. So I got a bit of a feeling of different sides of conservation. I then went and spent some time in South America working on big turtle population issues and also development issues. But I slowly came to the realization that there was only so far you could go with the science. When it came to then trying to fix the problem, you quite often needed to find ways of convincing people. And a lot of people, when you talk about issues or when you talk about data, their eyes glaze over. And I realized that actually there's a lot of power in the stories, even if the stories are quite anecdotal. And if human beings were rational, we would be responding to the data and we would go, okay, that population is going down. Let's do this thing about it. It doesn't seem to work like that. So I went through this realization that storytelling is actually a very powerful thing for conservation. And maybe that's where I should be putting some of my skills. I also had a couple of incidents in Australia where one was I had started quite a big volunteer network in Australia, diving, so looking at marine issues. And one of the issues we looked at was shark nets. Another was yachts that were they would drop their anchors, arrive, low carbon transport, fantastic, but they would drop their anchor off the coast and they were dropping it into the seagrass beds, which were seahorse habitat. And I just realized that nobody would want to be doing that. I'm sure the sailors would be horrified if they thought that's what they were doing. So anyway, I started talking about these issues and recording some of the data, and people were reasonably interested. I was a biologist, I had some data and I'd seen something and they were disinterested. And then I started going down with video cameras and stills cameras and getting amazing images of the beauty down there, but also the impacts. And then people were much more interested and the media were much more interested. And then I found when I became Australian freediving champion in a country like Australia, which is so obsessed by sports, suddenly they were really interested in everything I had to say about what was going on underwater. And I was at first pretty horrified by this. My very rational scientific brain was thinking, this is ridiculous. How are you more interested in my view as a free diver than as a scientist? And then I decided to not fight it and actually to really look at every situation through where are the compelling stories that can cause change. So yeah, that was my real getting into combining science and storytelling. And yeah, the bird thing, to be honest, I grew up in a country with a lot of birds and never really gave them that much thought because I was very comfortable underwater. And yeah, I came to the UK and found myself being asked to help a load of scientists looking at swans and working on wetlands. And that is what forced me into actually taking to the air. I had no previous really intention to go up in the air. But I found, the paramotoring, I mean, we can go into the paramotoring if you like, but I only started paragliding because I developed a horrible fear of any kind of turbulence in a plane from a bad flight. And that, believe it or not, is what took me into flying little paramotors, which are, I don't know if you've spoken about that on the podcast before, but it is literally hanging off a bit of fabric with a fan on your back. I mean, which seems ridiculous, yeah. But that's how I ended up with that through a load of scientists saying, please, can you help us fix this problem with swans? Yeah, that made me do it.
Wow. You had this personal story of this frightening trip with a small airplane,
Mm-hmm.
and that got you into paragliding initially, or is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
Weirdly. Yeah, it was myself and an anthropologist I was working with and two other people in the back of a small plane and just two people in the front, so the pilot and another other passenger sitting in the co-pilot seat, which wasn't reassuring either. But there were just six of us, and yeah, we went out to try and find this landing strip on one of the little islands in the San Blas Islands of Panama. There's about 3,000 of them, and we had to find one little airstrip, and the islands are so small, the airstrip sticks out both ends of this island. And we ended up in the most horrendous thunderstorm. The pilot had decided that he could outrun it and he couldn't. And so we were thrown around in this storm violently. There was lightning, there was hail, there was all kinds. And he kept diving down below the clouds. And the clouds were so low, they were pretty much strafing the tops of trees. And yeah, so for about 40 minutes he tried. The pilot had gone quite white in the face and he wouldn't speak to us at all. And he was just trying to find a landing strip. And we all thought that was it. Especially when we said, look, just turn back, go back to Panama City. And he said, we haven't got enough fuel, I won't make it. And that was like, oh gosh. So for 40 minutes, we all in the back thought that this was probably the end. And once he did find the landing strip and we landed, and he got out of the plane and lay on his back on the tarmac. And that was it. We carried on doing the work we had to do. But from then on, every time I got in a plane, there was any kind of turbulence, I was like gibbering, like uncontrolled panic monster. It was very weird considering I was, known for free diving. I rode motorcycles, things that have quite a lot of risk. Suddenly, everything to do with turbulence in a plane made me, gave me some kind of a panic. And it was trying to break that. So I realized after a few years, the only way I thought I could break that was for the scientist side of my brain, which was saying, of course, get in a plane. The risk is not that high. But the rational side of my brain could override it if I understood a bit more about air. And so I needed to be able to read why was the plane jumping up and down, so that my sensible part of my brain would go, it's okay, to the other side. And so, yeah, from that, I tried flying in small planes. I tried gliders, and there were just too much technical stuff going on. And for me, I didn't understand enough about all the engineering to be 100% sure of how solid the aircraft was and all the rest of it. But looking at a paraglide, I thought it's so simple. I can check every line, I can check all the cells of the fabric, and I can clearly see how it works. And the important thing is that you can feel what the air is doing. When it's moving up and down on the left, you can feel everything. So that was my idea of understanding air. So I started paragliding. It was really difficult. And by the time I was eventually, I think it was 2 years before I was comfortable flying and thermaling on my own.
Yeah, so you really embraced it. I think a paraglider is probably the aircraft where you'll be exposed to the elements and to the wind and to the turbulence in the most extreme way, unlucky compared to more protected aircraft. And then fast forward to, I think, 2016, you took the kind of first major trip, this flight with the Swans from the Russian Arctic to the UK, and actually not just as a campaign, but actually to collect data and insights on the migration of the buoy Swan. So tell us more about that, how that mission came about, and how you got from taking a few flights on a paramotor or doing like more flights in the UK to like this massive trip.
Yeah, I was so from the paragliding, I'd then seen somebody with a paramotor and saw, okay, with that, you can fly at dawn and dusk when the air is still and the light is beautiful. And aerial photography of wetlands, the habitats I was working on, that is really powerful because from the air, you see the world in a different way. So I was already taking photographs of wetlands and recreated habitats using a paramotor. So I was already at that point. And then I was asked by a load of scientists to look at the problems for the swans along a flyway. There were lots of different issues in different countries. They migrate across at least 11, depending on the route they take. But different issues in different countries. And the swan population was dropping really quickly. And for many of the researchers, their main problem was that some of them, they knew what they needed to do, but it was hard to make it a priority because the public weren't particularly interested and didn't realize there's different species of white swans. And the other challenge they had was that the birds fly across some of the remotest parts of the planet. So the Russian Arctic is important for lots of birds, but there's very few people up there, and in most of the areas, no roads and runways and things. So could there be something else going on up there that we don't know about? And we were pretty sure there was shooting going on up there from tourists from around the world, etc. So how on earth could we get through to those audiences? And the birds hit power lines where there's very developed areas. How can we figure out where the power lines are if people aren't aware of it enough to tell us? So there were lots of problems. And I was asked to try and get lots of different people to meetings. And I just looked at it and I thought the one key thing was the story they were telling was too miserable. Lots of birds dying, power line killing, illegal shooting, lead poisoning, all this kind of stuff. But how amazing to start that with a story of the journey from the Russian Arctic. There's from land of the polar bear across the biggest wild wetlands in the world, across the big, vast taiga forest, across Europe, and in autumn there's stormy weathers. There's definitely a James Bond story for swans there, and most people don't think that the elegant white swan at their pond in their village might have migrated all the way from the Russian Arctic. So could I bring that story to life? And could you also, how do you go and visit some of the remote places and talk to remote communities? What could they tell us that we don't already know? And I put 2 and 2 together and came up with 15 and realized that you could bring the story to life and see the impacts that could be happening for the birds by flying with them. And the only way that you could do that was in a paramotor because, like I said, there's no roads and runways in the north. With a paramotor, you can take off and land on your feet pretty much anywhere. You're exposed to the weather and the conditions. But one of the main things is when you stop and land with people, firstly, they're not scared of a paramotorist because you look like you've just jumped out of an airplane with a parachute on you. So people don't see you as some sort of arriving foreign force of some kind. And people always ask you a couple of questions, and that's, where have you come from? Is it dangerous? And how can I help? And particularly when I take my helmet off and they can see that I'm female. I'm not sure if the same works for men, but that was a key part of us, seeing from the air, being able to take photos and video, being in the places where the swans are at the time when they're there and seeing what could be the threats that they're facing right now, but also engaging thousands of people in this conversation. And we did that through meeting people in public, but also sharing the story through the media. So I filmed and photographed with me and the ground crew the whole expedition and gathered a lot more data, got a lot more people together and made a story and a big noise for 3.5 months. So nearly 2,000 pieces of media coverage, most of those television. So it made a massive impact on a few different levels.
What are some of the insights, some of the things you've learned on that trip about the Swan, but maybe also about climate change? Because we're going to talk about that very shortly. Any kind of key insights that you got from that trip that you can share?
There were many up in the Arctic. We knew already that some areas had said that shooting was happening up there. My main thing was in speaking to people in person, figure out what we could do about it and who were the leaders in the community that would be interested in engaging with us, and to really understand also what are the dynamics, what are the reasons. Is it for subsistence? Do they actually need to shoot swans to feed their family? Then you have a very different approach to, is it sports hunters coming from Italy that want to shoot 100 white birds, which is also a thing apparently, because that's a different way you solve that. But we needed to figure out not only what was the question, but who could the allies be. So there were those, but I have to say for me, the overriding issue the whole way was that climate change was exacerbating every other issue. And if it's like that for the swans, which are big white birds that people notice, it's likely to be like that for lots of other things as well. So the kinds of differences are, for example, up in the Arctic, the Nanette people laughed when I said, what would you say to people that don't really believe in climate change? They were like, you're supposed to be the educated people from the West. How can you not see this? They at one point fed me meat. They took open a big sort of canvas that was on top of a big ceramic pot that was buried in the permafrost. In it was a big vat of blood with pieces of reindeer meat in it. And it was quite rotten. It had been in there for a couple of weeks. And they did say, you can eat it like this, you won't get sick, but it wouldn't normally be this rotten. It's just that the permafrost is now so low that it's not keeping the food as cool anymore. And for them, these sorts of things are very real. They are concerned where they use migrating with the reindeer. One of the big concerns they have is the oil and gas extraction. Actually, the pipelines are raised on stilts all along the tundra. And as the tundra is thawing, the stilts that they're resting on become unstable. And so there are reasonably regular collapses of those, so the oil pipelines will break and leak oil. So for them, it's very practical, and pieces of their land are falling away quite quickly. So there's things like that. Also, looking at from the bird's point of view, the habitats, migrating species rely on different habitats all along the way, and they already have to adapt to change in general. But now that it's happening so fast, each time they get to a new stopover site where they rest and they feed again, the conditions in each one are changing, so they're having to adapt all the time. And then when they get to Europe, they're mostly relying now on feeding on waste food crops. But as humans change the food crops all the time, so what is available for them to eat now that there aren't enough wetlands for them, that also changes. So they're constantly having to come up with different ways of surviving on a migration. And the really big issue is, as weather is becoming more turbulent, more varied, it's providing more and more challenging flying conditions. So yeah, for me, I looked at it all and I just thought actually climate is the overriding factor in all of this. And if I can help us to get onto a different track on that front, then that should definitely be my mission.
Got it. And then you also had a very personal story related to the Australian bushfires. Tell us about that and how it made that issue of climate change very real again for you.
Yeah. The place I said I grew up in Australia with my mum, where we had wedge-tailed eagles that occasionally ate my little sister's guinea pigs, and wombats and lyrebirds running around the house. The audio recordings there were just a massive soundscape of bird life. It was beautiful. A river valley in the southeast of Australia. I found myself in December last year with my mum back in Australia. And it was bushfire season again, and mum has been in our rural bushfire brigade for quite some time. And there were bushfires on their way. We knew that. So we pumped 120,000 litres of water into 3 big tanks above the house so that we could defend the house if a fire came through, as had been done before. And then we had to sit and look at the news reports and look at the various different websites tracking the fires and realize that, this was something like out of this world. It was on a scale that we hadn't seen before. We eventually found ourselves looking at a fire front, which was like 40 kilometers long heading towards us. And it had turned from being a fire front to a fire and storm front that reached the clouds. So it was 11 kilometers high if you connect the whole lot. So we were looking at that, and and our house had been built of wood over time. So we had the difficult conversation with mum about the fact that there was no point in us staying here to fight this, because if it went wrong, we wouldn't be able to get out. And so we had to evacuate, and the fire came through and basically left nothing, absolutely nothing. It got so hot that the silver was melted off my mum's cutlery and things like that. So it got to over 1,000 degrees in there. And there's, what are we now, quite some months later, and some wildlife is just starting to come back. Mum's seen 1 kangaroo. There are now mosquitoes and some cabbage butterfly, and a few flies, but even like the insects are not back. The grass has grown back, and some of the trees are springing back to life, but a lot of them didn't survive it as well. So it's been pretty broadly devastating across a big area. And you could look at a situation like that, and it could break you, or you could look at it and go, I still don't think it's too late. I've still seen from the Swan project how much people can move if you tell a story in the right way, and you show people that everybody else will also step in and do their bit. And so all those pieces will add up to something significant. If we can get that messaging right, then I still think we can shift us all to a different direction.
That's very powerful. For somebody, I grew up in a rural area as well, but for somebody that's now spending most of his time in London, obviously these experiences that you share, both from your expeditions as well as obviously the very personal experience around the bushfires, makes it very real and rings the alarm bells even more than, as it is with humans, than scientific reports and numbers. Let's look at what you're actually planning to do now, and what an amazing project actually came out of this, rather not so great episode and things happening. Next year, the UK is hosting the UN climate conference. And as part of that, or in the kind of in preparation to that, as part of the campaigning around that, you're launching the Around Britain Climate Challenge. So tell us about that. What does that entail, and what will you do next year?
Okay, so that will see me trying to fly around the whole coast of Britain in paramotor, but this time powered by renewable energy. So it's battery powered and powered by renewable, along with the ground crew. So that is a bit of a mission in itself. I have a bit of a personal obligation, considering I do things which involve flying, and I ought to be looking at whether I can be reducing my fuel use on that. And so I'm really keen to test it, but also I'm not thinking for a second it doesn't have the capacity, or it won't have the capacity of a petrol powered motor. But just by trying, I'm hoping that will help to create a bit more interest, potentially promote further development in that area where we can. So I feel a bit of a personal obligation to do that. But it also, the fact that I can only do quite short flights, it gives us a perfect opportunity to all around the coast stop and talk to different people, and to make that the kind of star of the media event. So there's one thing is following the journey in the air, and that will be spectacular. Journeys from the air are great, but I want to speak to people who can explain what climate change means right now. What does it mean locally? Because most people around Britain, I find, still aren't aware of how it is changing their region and how it will change it in the future. But also in some areas that's very practical. It's impacting water availability, and that can have serious impacts. It's impacting what and how much food can be grown. And I think so farmers are often seeing that, but maybe not ordinary people. And whilst I don't really want to scare people, I definitely want people to be seeing what it means locally, because that on my journey definitely made me go from climate change being an intellectual thing to being something that I felt and motivated my action. We want to talk to people about what climate change means in the regions, but what I really want to do is talk to the people that have got the ideas, the innovations, and the natural solutions. And there are plenty of them, and that's what really inspire me. So yeah, we'll want to be talking for people who are helping us get out of move into a new low carbon economy, but also those who can use natural solutions. So by recreating some of the habitat we've lost, all of that will be absorbing more carbon, and meaning that the natural world can adapt to the changes that are coming anyway. So whilst all of that is quite a lot of information, because this will be running over a 5 or 6 week journey through lots of small stories, and I've got people like Breakfast Television interested, what they love about the way that this expedition will play out is that we can mix up the adventure, the beautiful scenery, meeting interesting people, and the issues and the solutions all at the same time. So hopefully we will basically be telling a big motivational story over 6 weeks and the journey.
And you will attempt to break 2 Guinness World Records at the same time. I don't even think anybody has done this type of trip at all with a paramotor, or if anything, not with an electric one. And then what are the records you're looking to break?
No, so they haven't done it at all, not even with an ordinary paramotor. And I'm not sure why, because coastal flying is stunning. That is one thing. So because it's a Guinness World Record, actually they like records that can be broken. So you can't really break a first, but you can break a fastest. So we'll be attempting the fastest, which will mean that it'll definitely be able to be broken, because I'm not really aiming for speed. But fingers crossed, if the paramotor as it's designed works well, then we'll make it. But the second record is for the most number of people engaging to do something about their personal carbon footprint. So that will be quite a big mission, and we're looking for lots of support from media, and we've got lots of other organizations in the country helping us to do that. But again, and that's one of those things that people are much more likely to do it if they can see lots of other people are doing it, and in other regions. So they're the 2 records.
Wow, that's great to see. I think all the best definitely for reaching both those. And it's a really amazing and inspiring challenge to embark on, definitely. Yeah.
And to be fair, the challenge of getting people signed up to do something about their own carbon footprint, that's being done through something called Counterstin, which is a global collaboration. That kind of app and tech is being developed by others, which is fantastic. And my main aim is to promote it as much as possible.
Amazing. Talk us through like some of the collaborators you've already convinced to join forces with you and some of the ambassadors that are putting their weight behind this. I saw that Dame Judi Dench is involved again and putting her name behind this. Tell us about who else is joining forces with you on this.
Yeah, so Dame Judi Dench her big issues are trees and climate change, and that's obviously a big thing for the UK. We have reasonably little forest left from what we had before, so she's very passionate about that and about climate change. But also being a distant relative, I was banking on her support in the first place, so that's great. Yeah, so we've got the key thing for me is that lots of organizations around the country are supportive, but there are also companies that are behind the counters in that. So people that you might not expect, like IKEA and British Telecom, are also seeing that this is really important, that they can use their audiences to engage as well. Could start listing companies and organizations, but with the networks that are involved, there's quite a lot. So from the Women's Institute to the Scouts to Rewilding Britain to Nature Friendly Farmers, quite a lot of support. And I think the events of the past year, the pandemic and everything else, have also driven people to this, looking at rewilding and sorting out nature is going to be core to so much of our future, even our economic future. Yeah, it's been easy to get people on board with this, I'd say.
Absolutely. I'd like to ask you one more question, and that's around the long-term vision, especially what you're doing with Conservation Without Borders and the campaigns and adventures that you're embarking on. And I'm sure this is not going to be the last one. How do you think will the world look like in 10 years if your work with Conservation Without Borders succeeds and your campaigns succeed?
So the vision is, whilst what I found through Flight of the Swans was that looking at the world through the eyes of migratory species is a really powerful tool. It gives a story that people want to engage with, but the overview effect of looking at the world from above I think is really important for people, and we miss it in our day-to-day lives where we're going about doing the normal stuff, surviving. If you can pull people out of that and get them to look at the planet and look at actually the fact that it is quite small and this is our life support system and that it is fragile and a bit broken, that is one thing. But also the nice thing you get from above is that all the problems that we have actually look a bit smaller. And the fact that most of the problems we're facing now are global. We are a global society at the moment. It's very easy to say, look, why should I bother doing that? Or why is it worth me bothering doing my piece? Because actually there's so many, impacts from elsewhere that we can't really deal with this. But when you are flying a migration route and seeing actually that lots of people along a route and around the world care about the same kind of things and are inspired by similar things. So we're not that different. And I found that one of the things I found on the last expedition was people were instantly excited by the idea of Crazy Lady trying to fly with the birds. But the thing that interested them was the science and the story that's got them thinking. But what made them start to go, oh, yes, I can do my piece or I can do something, was stories about other people doing their thing. So I think that is why following migration routes of species, whilst the species themselves need help, it's a really powerful story for getting people involved. So with that, we made the next 10 years, we've wrapped into something called the 2030 Global Challenge, a series of expeditions around the world, but literally spanning the whole world through the eyes of different species. And a big part of that is motivating people. So I suppose within the next 10 years, what we've got to do is at least shift our thinking, shift our level of ambitions, and shift a lot of the systems so that we can get to being carbon neutral by 2050. And we really have to do that. So I suppose that is what we're trying to do, create big, global, loud stories. And with what we learned from the last trip and amplification through the media, we really think we can do that. We can make each of these expeditions, we can make them something that people from around the world, not just those along the route, will follow and will be inspired by. So that's the vision, that within 10 years, we've shifted a load of the systems that we need to in order to get on the right track.
I'm really looking forward to that journey and especially to next year and that campaign. I think with the UN Climate Summit, there's really, again, like a very crucial inflection point in how we deal with climate change. We hopefully now got a US president that's a bit more supportive again of this. And I think there's been some promising announcements in the UK as well around climate change policy, but I think there's definitely a need to put even more focus on this issue and take action.
Yeah.
And it's really great to talk to you about that and see how you will be highlighting those that take action and take action yourself by doing this challenge. So thanks very much for joining us today. It was really inspiring to talk to you, and I'm sure it won't be the last time we speak to each other.
Fantastic. Yes. Thank you.